Good morning. I'm Jessica Matthews, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's a great pleasure to welcome you this morning. We are lucky enough to have with us Senator Carl Levin, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, to talk about U.S. policy in Syria. The saying goes that hard cases make bad law, and if that's true, it is also certainly true that hard crises offer nothing but bad choices and sometimes disastrous ones. And the challenge for policymakers is only to discern among various classes of bad and hard choices. And I think it's fair to say that since the very outset of this crisis more than 2 years ago, that's what has been offered to the United States, and why it has been so hard and so vexing to find a direction that commands broad support in this country. Senator Levin is just back from a trip to the region with Senator King of Maine, visiting Turkey and Jordan, and he is therefore in a position to give us some, has been thinking hard about what we might do. I think, well, I won't say those needs no introduction words. Let me instead say that Senator Levin has served in the Senate for more than 30 years. He has announced that he will not run in 2014 so that he can devote his last 2 years to the issues that confront the country without having also to be thinking about another campaign. He has chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee twice. Some years ago, Time magazine named him one of the 10 best senators. That was a very easy call. I think you would find that if you have that group, the general consensus in Washington would put him certainly among the much smaller handful of the best, most effective, most thoughtful members of the Senate. So we are really honored to have you this morning and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on what next in Syria. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, and thanks not just for the great introduction, but also for your leadership here at the Carnegie Endowment. This endowment has been an important forum for the discussion of foreign policy issues for more than 100 years. And we appreciate all that you do here, and your globally focused think tanks truly are a gift to the world. And now, as Jessica mentioned, I just returned from a 5-day trip to the Middle East with Senator Angus King of Maine. And we are indeed in an eventful and a very chaotic period in that part of the world. In Egypt, the military has removed a democratically elected president. In Syria, a major insurgency is attempting to remove Assad while his regime continues a brutal reign of terror against the Syrian people. In Turkey, President Erdogan has stumbled in his response to peaceful demonstrations, setting back his efforts to modernize the country's constitution and to resolve the Kurdish conflict. In Iraq, a deepening sectarian conflict has resulted in the greatest levels of violence since our troops left the country. And in Afghanistan, President Karzai continues to act as though he wants us to leave, while his real purpose is to get us to stay on his terms. For more than a decade, since September 11th, we have had a tendency to view this part of the world primarily through the lens of terrorism and Islamic extremism, failing to recognize the complex array of issues that continue to roil the region. It is striking how little the events that I just described have been driven by terrorism and extremism, but they are rather the result of changing demographics and new communications technologies and of the failure of regimes to respond to the needs of their people. Relative to Syria, for example, the experts that we talked to on our trip told us that the Syrian people do not tend to be religious extremists. The core elements of extreme groups like al-Nusra and Hezbollah are foreign fighters, supported by foreign money. They have gained strength in Syria not because of their ideology, but because of their fighting effectiveness. Now, while there's always the risk that a lengthy civil war could radicalize more of the Syrian population, we have reason to hope that the Syrian people will be able to marginalize and expel terrorist entities after the fall of the Assad regime. Assad is a murderous dictator, but he is not an Islamic extremist. He has relied on the support of Iran and Hezbollah, not because he agrees with their radical views, but because he needs their help to keep his grip on power. In fact, Assad recently expressly claimed the mantle of a secular leader as he celebrated the Egyptian army's decision to throw out the Muslim Brotherhood president in Egypt. Events in Egypt also appear to have been driven more by political and economic forces than by terrorism or religious extremism. Now, surely the overthrow of a democratically elected government in the Middle East should give us pause. And while I welcome the departure of President Morsi, who deepened his country's divisions, I do not welcome the manner in which the change was made. There may be circumstances in which the overthrow of a democratically elected government is justified. For example, if it systematically attacks its own people. There should be a very high threshold for such action, however, and that threshold was not met in Egypt. Now, our trip was focused on Syria. Senator King and I traveled to Turkey and Jordan, where we discussed the situation in Syria with military, diplomatic, and intelligence officials, met with the leader of the Free Syrian Army, visited American military and civilian facilities, Syrian refugee camps, and a border crossing where Syrians were making their way across a no man's land into Jordan, fleeing the brutality of the Assad regime. We all know the basic outlines of that brutality. Assad's use of air strikes, missiles, helicopters, tanks, and artillery to systematically attack the Syrian people. His targeting of civilians in residential neighborhoods, markets, and even schools. His use of chemical weapons and his increasing reliance on foreign fighters from Iran and Hezbollah to sustain his rule of terror. His actions have killed more than 100,000 Syrians, led more than 1 million to flee the country, forced millions more to leave their homes, leveled entire villages and neighborhoods, and motivated the Syrian people to rise up against him. What Senator King and I saw on our trip put a human face on that campaign of terror. We met carpenters, school teachers, imams, farmers, shopkeepers, and former soldiers of the Syrian army. They told a similar story. When and where the Assad regime felt threatened, it would shell Sunni villages and neighborhoods, systematically uproot entire populations and drive them from their homes. The displaced sought shelter in the mosques and schools, and even there, they were not safe. The Turks and the Jordanians have taken on the task of welcoming the hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees crossing their borders, and they've done a commendable job of providing not just food and shelter, but, to the best of their ability, classrooms, places of worship, and social centers. It's heartbreaking to see row upon row of tents and containers with refugees, most often women and children, sitting in the dust and seeking shade to shelter them from the heat. Now, we all agree that these events are tragic, but most Americans ask, why is this our fight? Can we make a difference in the Syrian conflict, and if so, should we? Or are the costs and risks of even limited military support for the insurgents simply too high? Now, I believe there are many reasons that we need to do more to increase the military pressure on Assad. There's Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people. And while I'm not a fan of red lines that risk committing the United States to a particular course of action, regardless of the specific circumstances, I do not believe the United States and our allies should allow the global consensus against the use of chemical weapons to fray. If Assad is able to use chemical weapons and remain in power, other dictators may come to believe that they too can turn weapons of mass destruction on their own people and not be challenged. Nor can we afford for these weapons to fall into the hands of Hezbollah, al-Nusra, or other terrorist organizations now asserting themselves in Syria. Assad's survival would strengthen terrorist organizations and state sponsors of terrorism. We will be less secure here in the United States if Iran and Hezbollah succeed in keeping Assad in power, increasing their ability to bring their terrorist tactics to the borders of Israel and the rest of the world. Even if Assad's regime survives only in the populated areas of Syria, large regions of the country would be left ungoverned, providing safe havens from which al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations can attack the United States and our friends and allies. I believe increased military pressure on Assad is the only way to achieve a negotiated settlement in Syria, which in turn is needed to restore stability to a region that certainly doesn't need any more instability. Already, the growing flood of Syrian refugees is causing serious economic hardship in Jordan and to a lesser extent in Turkey. Prospects for peace between Turkey and the Kurds are dimmer, and the already shaky relationship between Iraq and its Kurdish population has been further complicated. And the increasingly sectarian nature of the fight between Syrian Sunnis and Shiites risks a broader civil war that could spread to Iraq and Lebanon and inflame the entire region. Strengthening the insurgency's ability to increase military pressure on the Assad regime is the best hope, and perhaps the only hope, for a political settlement that might deal with those issues. And finally, can the world in good conscience continue to stand aside and let Assad murder hundreds of thousands more civilians? The damage Assad is inflicting on Syria's neighborhoods and towns isn't collateral, it's intentional. He is targeting entire villages and neighborhoods. Terrorizing with indiscriminate shelling and killing is Assad's goal. Creating massive numbers of refugees to weaken the opposition and to overwhelm his neighbors. Working with allies, we were able to help the people of the Balkans in the 1990s and the people of Libya in 2012. We can and we should do the same in Syria. The objective of the United States and our allies continues to be a political settlement that transitions Syria to a post-Assad regime that is inclusive of and protective of all elements of Syrian society. This is going to require actions to change the current military dynamic in Syria, to try to convince the Assad regime and its supporters, including Russia, that the current military momentum toward the regime cannot last in the face of a major insurgency that has the support of both the Syrian people and an international coalition. 2 weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that the CIA had begun moving weapons to Jordan and planned to start arming small groups of vetted Syrian opposition with light weapons and possibly anti-tank missiles within a month. I would not only support such efforts, I would expand these efforts to help the Syrian people succeed in doing what only they can do: wage a successful insurgency to free their country from Assad's brutal regime. The United States should join with other members of the so-called London 11, including a number of Arab countries in the region who openly oppose the Assad regime, to comprehensively plan additional steps to up the military pressure on the Assad regime. Such plans could include options for limited targeted strikes at Assad's apparatus of terror, including his air power and artillery, coordinated with the actions of the Syrian opposition on the ground. Such strikes could degrade Assad's military capabilities and bring some relief to the embattled Syrian people. Even the announcement of a coordinated planning process for increased support to the Syrian opposition would show Assad and his Russian allies the serious purpose of a broad international coalition. It would boost the morale of the Free Syrian Army. It would advance our limited goal of bringing about a political solution. When Assad raised his forces to create a killing zone in another Syrian city or town, we know where those forces are and how they can be targeted. In recent weeks, we have watched Assad systematically bombard and physically destroy Qusair and Homs. Next in line will be other cities in Syria's main north-south corridor, including Hama to the north and Dara, which is practically within sight of the Jordanian border, to the south. We and our allies have the ability to help insurgents by targeting some of Assad's instruments of destruction. It is inconsistent with our national interest and our moral conscience to watch more massacres continue to go unchallenged. Any direct action against the Syrian regime, albeit limited, would need to be taken by a broad alliance, including countries from the region, and would need to be preceded by a concerted planning effort to ensure that we are prepared to act in a united manner. Earlier this week, Senator King and I called upon the administration to begin this planning process by convening a meeting of the political, military, and intelligence leaders of countries committed to the end of the Assad regime. The objective would be to develop specific options and plans for a range of contingencies and to enlist commitments from our coalition partners so that the Assad regime and its supporters will understand the seriousness of purpose of this joint effort. It is not only important that Assad goes, it is also important that his departure not create a vacuum into which Sunni Shia divisions deepen and spread, and which results in safe havens from which al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations could again bring suffering and terror to the United States and to our friends and allies. Unless there is a planned transition to an inclusive political and military structure to provide a secure and stable follow-on to Assad, a longer civil war could replace the current conflict, bringing unspeakable additional suffering to the Syrian people and spiraling instability to the region. I know of no one who is proposing American boots on the ground, but we can and we should support the Syrian people's struggle, their insurgency, by helping train and equip them, and by helping establish a broad international coalition to increase the military pressure on the Assad regime. That is the best way to promote a negotiated transition to a Syria with a legitimate government that protects its people instead of attacking them. Now, we should not be blind to the risks and uncertainties of these kinds of actions, but nor should we ignore the repercussions if we fail to act. More Syrian towns and neighborhoods will be destroyed. Hundreds of thousands more families will be forced from their homes. Another 100,000 or more innocent people will be killed. The conflict could spread through the region, and Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations can gain safe havens from which to operate against us in the future. These are the likely costs of inaction, and I believe that they are too high. Now, Jessica, in her introduction, said that I would hopefully talk about some options which might gain, in her words, the broad support of the American people. I doubt that the proposals that I have talked about here this morning fill that bill. On the other hand, these are what I believe to be the essential steps that need to be taken. We know the American people are very, very dubious, and understandably so after so many years of war, of taking any steps which look like it may involve us in additional military action. And that's why what I've tried to do is outline very limited steps to support the Syrian people. It is an insurgency, and I emphasize that word, which is going on in Syria. The book has been written on counterinsurgency. Dave Petraeus has gained some fame for writing a book on counterinsurgency. But we are in a different position. It is not a counterinsurgency which we have to consider. It is supporting an insurgency, not a group which takes on a Syrian army, but a group which has the strong support of the Syrian people against a brutal regime. And if the international community will come together, obviously with some exceptions, but the broad array of nations that believe that Assad must go, and if they show some willpower and some planning for some unified, limited action that would support the insurgents, this again, I believe, is the best hope of showing Assad that he cannot succeed against the willpower of his own people and of the international community, which in turn is the best hope for a political arrangement to be met and negotiations to achieve such an arrangement. So although, Jessica, I know I can't possibly fill your hope for a consensus outline of steps which might have the broad support of the American people, I hope that I have at least outlined a course of action which, if it's the best of a lot of bad options, might over time not only win the support of the American people, but live up to the kind of values and self-interests which must guide us always. Thanks again for the invitation. I'd be happy to try to answer some questions. I'm going to end up with something like your cast if I don't walk.
All right. I think perhaps would it be appropriate maybe to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, because I can see already there's 100 of them out there.
At a time?
And then let you...
At my age, remembering 2 at a time probably is about my max, but I'll make some
All
notes.
right.
I'll be happy to make some notes.
We'll start right here and then go here. So I'll try to work my way back a bit.
Thank you very much. It's Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and from almonitor.com. Senator Levin, could you be a little bit more specific in terms of what sort of targets you think might be hit, and also address concerns about the nature of the opposition? You said that the Syrian people are not religious extremists, but the groups that have been most successful in fighting against Assad do appear to be extremists, and there is also considerable disarray in terms of the political opposition. They have not been able to unify behind a series of folks who have clout within. Also, we read, I think just yesterday in the New York Times, that members of Congress are actively blocking any weapons from going. So, have any weapons actually gotten into the hands, U.S. weapons or U.S. paid-for weapons, gotten into the hands of the opposition? Thank you.
Well, wait a minute. That's about 3 questions in one. I'm not going to be able to, I don't think, where there's a 2 or 3 part question like that, that's my max. there are extremist groups that are part of a group of insurgents that are fighting against Assad. And that's why it's careful that any support that we provide or that we join in providing be to carefully vetted people. That process has been going on for some time, and I'm satisfied that it will continue with General Idris in the lead of a free Syrian army, that his goal, we met with him at length, is the same, and that most of the insurgents have a goal of a pluralistic Syria. Not all of them. And so that gets to the point that I made, that we have a realistic hope, I believe, that if we can get rid of Assad, that the Syrian people are not traditionally or are not inherently religious extremists, and that they can expel the extremist groups. It's a little bit in that regard like Afghanistan, facing an extremist group and having an army which is more and more able and hopefully will succeed, and we believe it can, in removing that power from the Taliban. So that's part of your question. In terms of the second part of your question, I'd love to answer it, but I can't. I'm not allowed to answer it. I can't confirm what Congress and its intelligence, at least in the Senate Intelligence Committee, is doing. I can't even confirm what the administration has asked. I'm not allowed to. I'm a member of the Intelligence Committee, ex officio, but nonetheless a member. I've been there at the meetings, including yesterday, and I'm just not allowed. All I can say is that there are reports of requests, and I support those, if those reports are accurate. But I can't. But I can't confirm they're accurate. Now, this is hard for me. Believe me, it's very difficult for me to have to qualify it that way. I have to say, if reports are accurate, I'd support it. I can't tell you the reports are accurate, even though I know whether or not they're accurate. How's that for compounding a problem? But at any rate, so I can only tell you what I support. And I can only tell you what you obviously know from the depth that's reflected in your question, which is what the press is reporting.
And can you go back to the question about targets?
Yeah, I'm sorry, on targets, I try to describe what targets could be, everywhere from airfields. It can be targets which can be reached with standoff capability. It's critical that any such effort be two things, meet two tests. One, it's got to be reflective of a unified coalition. And secondly, it's got to be carefully planned, and in my judgment, it should be stated in advance, particularly to the Russians, as to what the implications are of a continuing failure to support negotiations to reach a negotiated settlement. So it's a two-part test. It's limited. I would say, by the way, that I favor anti-tank weapons being sent to the proper people, and they can have a real impact. In terms of, though, that's not the target. So that, in a sense, that's the target. The target there is tanks. But in terms of the kind of targets which you may be referring to, I would say mainly airfields, airplanes, and massed artillery, capable of being reached from standoff weapons.
The last bit was about the opposition.
Yeah, it's I think our goal has to be to continue to try to unite the opposition, do everything we can. They picked new leadership the other day, and hopefully it will work. But that's just one of many, many problems here. They need to politically come together. We need to lead that effort.
Ken Meyercord, World Docs. Is the situation in Syria as close as we've come to direct military confrontation with the Russians since the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I'd have to go back. First of all, I don't think we're close to a confrontation with the Russians, so I wouldn't want to try to, and struggling to go back over, 50 years? To try to answer your question, I wouldn't want to suggest that we're anywhere close to a confrontation with the Russians, because I don't think we are. So I'd have to really do some research and go back to think whether or not we've been, I mean, we had some differences with the Russians in Bosnia. We had some different, we've had a lot of differences with the Russians during that time period, which has not led to military confrontation, and I don't think this one will, so it's kind of, that's the best I can do.
If I could rephrase the question, are we on a collision course with the Russians?
Not militarily, no.
Let's take some questions in the back, because and I can't see the individual, but yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Leah Miller from Search for Common Ground. I was wondering if you could tell us about the newly elected opposition leadership. In the ones elected in Istanbul?
No, I really don't know enough about them yet. It's too recent for me to have an assessment.
Okay, next to, go ahead, yeah.
Just following up on that point, do you think the Russian position would shift if that leadership formed a government that was recognized internationally and asked for military intervention?
It would help. It clearly would help if they come together, become credible, respected, and when you say request intervention, is that the last word you said?
It was, but I mean, I'm not.
I don't think that's what I'm proposing. Support, I would say.
So military support, I think.
Increase on military pressure, yes. But I think there's already plenty of support for that from the Syrian Free Syrian Army, to bring that about. But if your hypothesis worked out with a credible opposition government that made a request and got international support, I think that would help, not only in terms of response from other countries, but response from this administration.
Adam Garfinkel, the American Interest. Senator, I was very sympathetic to the kinds of things that you are proposing a year and a half ago, before things really started to get out of hand, before the opposition got radicalized, before the state was in tatters. Over time, I've become more reluctant to endorse the kinds of things that you are talking about because I worry about the Phase 4 syndrome. How many years, how much effort, how much money would it take to put Syria back together again these days? And in the old phrase, you know, it's one thing to burn down the outhouse, it's another to install plumbing. I don't doubt that we can burn down the outhouse, but I wonder whether we can install plumbing given the experiences we had with reconstruction in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
I'm not sure I want to associate with your remarks about outhouses. That's, I'm trying to think about that one. Number one, it's a long time, unless there's a political settlement. It's an insurgency. It's an insurgency worth supporting. Insurgencies take a long time, and so I wouldn't want to suggest that it's something where if some additional weapons are supplied, that insurgency can prevail militarily, because that's not the purpose of an insurgency, of this insurgency. The stated purpose of this insurgency is to help drive the regime to a political settlement. I believe that it can do that. If there are trained people, there are insurgents, believe me, there are plenty of people willing to fight with training and with weapons, including anti-tank weapons. They are willing to fight. They are in the majority, the clear majority, partly for religious reasons, which is not the desire. The ideal reason isn't to have a Sunni-Shia issue going on, but a lot of this is that the attacks on the Sunni community by that regime have energized and strengthened the will and resolve of the Sunni communities that have been shelled and bombed to take up arms against this regime. How long would it take? Depends how, in part, I think, whether or not Russia will be persuaded to remove its support of Assad and tell Assad he's got to get to a negotiating table. So, and I understand why in the last year and a half things have looked more complicated from your perspective. And they have in a way, because the military power, at least in the last few months of that year and a half, tends to shift. But the key to this is whether or not you believe that the Syrian people have the will to maintain an insurgency against Assad? That's the key question I think that people need to ask themselves. Do they have the will? Is there that kind of support in the Syrian people? I've seen it in those camps. I've seen it talking to people who are, I got to be careful here as to what I have seen. I know it's there. I can't say I know it's there in the people who are being trained.
Good morning, Senator Levin. My name is Joanna Al-Qudsi. I'm from Syria. I was actually born and raised in Aleppo. And I agree with what you said about the Syrian people not being inherently Islamistic or extremist. In fact, I would argue that they're also not inherently sectarian. But like many people here, and I know abroad, I'm also concerned about should these weapons be sent to rebels in Syria, or any weapons be sent into the country, whether or not they can be traced, what kind of weapons they are. I know you can't answer specifics, but theoretically, if you had to decide exactly what weapons to send, would you send Russian ones, or would you send American ones so that the ammo would be controlled? What would you say about tracing weapons inside Syria? Thank you.
I support getting weapons, particularly anti-tank weapons, into the hands of trained and vetted insurgents. Now, it's been reported, here's what the president said. I just want to let you know why I have to be so cautious, and I think maybe you can appreciate that I've got to live up to the requirements that are placed upon me. This is what the president said, what the president's spokesperson said on June 13th, that we're going to expand our assistance to the Supreme Military Council. The president, that's the president's position. Doesn't say what that assistance is made up of, doesn't say where the assistance, whether it's ours, whether it's weapons, if those weapons are ours, whether they come from other places. So all I can say is that what I favor, and what I favor is specifically as examples, getting anti-tank weapons that are available into the hands of the trained and vetted insurgents. I just want to use that as an example. I don't want to go beyond that because it, to me, isn't the point, whether or not those, I know legalistically it may be the point, but I don't think it's really the point in the real world as to whether those weapons are funded by or have a stamp of Saudi Arabia on them or whether they got a stamp of the U.S. on them.
Right here. There are two right there. Go ahead.
Hi, Senator. My name is Ben Goldsmith. I'm with America's Impact. I was wondering if you could tell us whether you've been hearing from constituents about this issue, and if so, what they've been saying.
Well, most constituents are involved in other issues, number one. But to the extent that you hear from constituents, I believe that most would say that would start at least with the position until they've heard my brilliant exposition that they don't see a reason to get engaged in another matter which could lead or which has the air of any aspect of leading to a greater military involvement anywhere. I mean, there's a huge skepticism, and it's understandable. So if I just read the public opinion polls, I wouldn't be making a speech here today, because I think the public opinion is very skeptical. And again, I emphasize, as someone who respects public opinion but doesn't always follow it, because I think my role is to ultimately do what I think is best for our country, even if it may be unpopular. Nonetheless, I believe that public opinion is skeptical, and understandably so, given the fact that we've spent huge amounts of blood and treasure in the last decade and, or more now in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Sir, right here.
Senator, I'm Bob Mary of the National Interest Magazine. You indicated that you weren't sure that the events in Syria are inextricably tied to America's national interest, and yet you thought that for humanitarian reasons,
No,
largely,
I
if
did,
understood.
interest I put before the humanitarian part. Interest was, our national interest is the second reason, because if Syria does not get rid of Assad, and if Assad using Hezbollah and other terrorist groups is in a place where it's most of its country could be used as safe havens by people who want to attack us, which is what would happen unless Assad goes, then you got the same situation which you had in Afghanistan, with terrorist groups that having a safe haven in that country, the way they had in Yemen and still may, that can attack us. That is our specific national interest, our national security interest, and I put that ahead intentionally of my reference to the humanitarian reason for not just standing by, and it could be within miles of the Jordanian border, while a large town in Syria is next on the list to be taken and shelled and massacred by Assad. Okay, so I do put the security interest ahead of the humanitarian interest.
Okay, thank you.
All right, in the middle there.
Me?
Yeah.
Sarah Chase, Carnegie Endowment. I wanted to come back to the phase 4 discussion and your discussion of a follow-on that could be stable. I think that in a lot of the recent military engagements, we tend to get fixated on the military aspects of it and how many troops are going to do what or how many weapons are going to go where. What do you see as the critical planning elements for what happens afterwards? And if not boots on the ground, do you think that shoes on the ground would be necessary to help Syria bring itself back together?
I think the reference before to a political coming together of the groups that want Assad to go is critical, and that coming together has to occur in advance for phase 4 to be successful. And it's got to have an agreement on an approach in Syria, a constitution in Syria, which protects diversity and pluralism in Syria. That's got to be part of it. Otherwise, we're in an Iraq situation. And I happen to be one who voted against going into Iraq for many reasons, but part of the mistake of Iraq, other than going in, which was a mistake, was not having a plan for the aftermath. And I think we have to, through the London 11 meetings and through other meetings of the mainly of the groups that are politically going to have to put Syria back together, that needs to be done in advance.
Okay, gentleman right here.
Dakhil Shamoud, the Kurdish service at Voice of America. Senator Levin, do you think that arming the opposition groups will create a situation that Assad will come to a point that said to the opposition groups, or will create a situation that Assad will go to ask more help from Iran and Hezbollah? As a result, we will see more fightings in Syria?
First, I think he's getting all he can already. So, I mean, this is the question of whether or not, if you'll try to level the playing field to create a situation where negotiations can succeed, whether or not that action of trying to level the playing field to have a free Syrian group of insurgents being able to defend themselves, or at least to take on some aspects of the artillery and the planes that are pummeling their villages, to give them that possibility to resist, it seems to me, is the right way to go, for the reasons I gave and won't repeat again. But the argument could be made, which is what you're making, well, that will just get Assad then to seek more. And I think he's seeking all he can get anyway. In other words, he's not measured or calibrating how many Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon he's getting. He's going to get as many as he can to try to quash an insurgency. And he may make the argument that he needs more help from Iran or Russia or Hezbollah in Lebanon, but he's, I think, making the same arguments anyway. And that argument can always be made for not giving people an opportunity to remove a dictator, is that the dictator will come down even more harshly. It's the historic argument against taking on dictatorships. And I'm not persuaded by that argument. I think you've got to, where you've got this situation, that you've got to give these insurgents, particularly if you believe it's a pluralistic country inherently, if you believe it's not a country which is likely to fall into the hands of radical groups on the other side. And Syria does not have that history. If you have confidence that a Syria free of Assad could be a place where minorities and where the majority would respect minorities, then the course I've outlined, I believe, is the right course. As Jessica would say, the best of a lot of terrible options. But doing nothing for me is not an acceptable option in these circumstances.
Way in the back.
My name is Obab Khalil. I'm Chief of Staff for the Syrian Coalition. First of all, thank you very much, Senator, for your support. And thanks to the United States, because they are the largest donor when it comes to the humanitarian. I'm also Syrian, born and raised in Syria. I'm from what's so-called the minority, Alawite, but I'm Syrian overall. My question is, from your position as Senator, would the Congress be more of taking the lead behind the administration, which is the administration so far on reaction mode, collecting information, or would it probably think of a proactive plan for the situation in Syria? Because what we see just reaction after reaction without well thought out 5 or 10-year plan for not have a country squeezed between extremists, whether it is Qaeda or whether it is Hezbollah and affiliate. Thank you very much.
I think most members want a plan if they're going to support greater effort in Syria. And I think it's fair to say that many of my colleagues do not see a plan. And that's why I emphasize the need for it. And so I think, I'm trying to answer your question, I think that's really what many of my colleagues feel is so far missing. I hope if they see one or are persuaded that there is one, that then they will respond to any requests from the administration.
We have time for 2 more questions. Let me ask, who has questions that have not been asked? You have a question that
I'm not going to share it with you. All
right,
I'm not going to give you any hints.
Hello, Aki Peretz from Third Way. In order to strike targets within Syria, we must first destroy Syria's integrated air defense system. General Dempsey said this would take up to 700 sorties. Would you first support 700 American strikes on their air defense system before hitting their, as you say, their massed artillery or military air bases, because we're the only ones who have the capabilities to do this? Thank you.
I think that you would have to remove the air defense if you were going to fly sorties into Syria. If our aircraft actually went into Syrian airspace, you'd have to knock out their air defense. And I don't want to pretend that I'm anywhere in the same category as General Dempsey, who has tremendous respect, by the way, on the Hill. But I've gone into this in enough detail that I believe that standoff weapons can make a difference.
Gentleman in the middle.
And therefore, don't have to remove the air defense because Syrian airspace would not be violated or not be entered.
All right, there's a gentleman right here in the front row.
Hi, Senator. John Harper with the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. Would you define what happened in Egypt as a military coup? And
Yes,
if so,
I would.
And do you think that should trigger a suspension of U.S. military aid?
I do.
And on Syria, why do you think
But let me before you go back to Syria, I do think it's a coup. And by the way, it's not just the word coup in the statute. The word decree is in the statute. In other words, and I'm assuming much too much when I answer I have to expand on that. The statute which says that the non-military aid will be cut off in the event of a coup, not just in Egypt, well, in this case in Egypt, also says in the event of a coup or where the military by decree removes a democratically elected government. So I happen to believe it's a coup, but I also focus on the word decree. I think our law requires that the non-military aid be suspended. I favor suspending is my verb, as the law requires, until there is a clear move, not just an announcement of a move the way it's been made by the new government, but a clear path that is being followed, not just proposed or not just rhetorically stated, but is actually in place and moving towards the restoration of a elected government. My answer, though, is I believe it is a coup, and I believe that the aid should be suspended, in my word. Now, I interrupted you.
Oh, no. Is there any consensus on the Hill as to whether it was a coup and whether the military aid should be suspended?
No.
Do you think
I don't
that
think there's a consensus on the Hill on anything. As a matter of fact, I wish someone had asked me, is there a consensus on the Hill on any subject? Please tell us what it is. So the answer, that was an easy one. Thanks for ending with an easy question.
All right, unfortunately, we have to stop. Please join me in thanking Senator Levin.